Hello, this is again Pascal from Neutrality Studies. I'm back with the second part of an interview with Dr. Yu Bin. Dr. Yu Bin, who earned his PhD from Stanford University. He's a senior fellow of the Russian Studies Center of the East China Normal University in Shanghai, and a senior fellow of the Shanghai Association of American Studies. In this second part of the interview, we touched on China's foreign policy in its borderlands, most importantly on Taiwan, and we then looked at how the conflict in Europe now impacts this strategic thinking. So please enjoy.
For Taiwan, I think that's the main issue, perhaps of maybe more important than anything else, that because it became a highly militarized, it's becoming more and more dangerous. If anything, the Taiwan issue, maybe more than the Korean Peninsula issue, can quickly escalate onto a major power conflict between China on the one side and the United States and its allies on the other side. But let me emphasize one point. The Taiwan issue was first and foremost a political issue that has been managed by political insight and foresight of both sides ever since 1971, when Henry Kissinger traveled to China. In July 1971, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, now he's 98 or 99 years old, he traveled to Beijing and secretly talked to the Chinese side and paved the way for President Nixon's official visit next spring in February 1972, when both sides reached agreement that Taiwan, both sides of Taiwan Strait recognize one China. The United States have no dispute with that. So that's the first of a series of bilateral agreements. The first Shanghai communique, and then later when Jimmy Carter signed another Shanghai communique, and then Ronald Reagan had another. So these are the official documents. They basically try to preserve the status quo that has been given rise to peace, prosperity, and stability of East Asia ever since the 1970s. Now people say, well, look at the East Asian economic miracle and this and that. But if you look at who provides the overall security framework, it was the absence of Sino-US conflict. And both sides agreed to freeze that point until the future. And so that's a political decision, but the United States actually started to move away from it. Now it's increasingly become a military issue, or militarized, which is a big problem for East Asia. For the Chinese side, Taiwan is not an ordinary border conflict. Taiwan is part of China. Until the pro-independence party, PPP, won the year 2000 election, I think both sides has agreed with that. Now, increasingly, we see Taiwan side start to move away from it, citing democracy, human rights. These are wonderful things, but the problem is this political arrangement now being undermined, jeopardized, and that's the most difficult issue. Let me give you one case. A few days before Trump left office, the situation between United States, Taiwan, and mainland China became so intense when Trump actually authorized his State Department to do away with all the restrictions in developing political relations with the Taiwan official side. The mainland China interpret this as a major I would say it's a Chinese red line. So and it's so dangerous that the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations was about to go to Taiwan, and the Chinese actually talk about use of force. And I think her airplane was in the air for several hours before landed back to Washington D.C. I don't think the Biden team wanted to do that, and for that, the chairman of the general staff, General Milley, talked to the Chinese side and telling him that don't overreact to Trump's China policy, and we're in control. So that's it was a very dangerous time, and I think with the Biden administration, before the Ukraine conflict, the Biden's focus was on China. The Chinese are really upset with this, and Biden and Chinese leader talked this twice over the phone, and the Chinese told the other side not to step away from the political arrangements. But that's increasingly impossible as China has become a big issue in American domestic politics. And it's very difficult for the United States to move away from the hostilities towards China. So that's the danger. I hope that the two sides would be able to work out something to stabilize the situation, not just for themselves, but also for peace, for the regional stability and global stability. And if something breaks out across Taiwan Strait, I think the Ukraine conflict will become a child of play. You'll see the collision of two giants, and something that really the end of global peace. So that's I think it requires wisdom, patience, and goodwill, and a pragmatic thinking back to those Cold War times when leaders, scholars, analysts most of them are actually realists. Now these realists are endangered species, like a neutrality concept, right? You have to take a side. Japan has to jump in. Japan created all the Taiwan problem, at the end of 19th century. And the Korean problem too was created by the Japanese. Now Japan is ready to jump in. And I think this is a very dangerous time. So that's I think we need to have a different type of thinking. We need to respect history. We need to think about the bigger issue rather than one's own gains or ambitions. So let's work together.
I very much agree with that. Taiwan could be the Sarajevo of this decade, which would be absolutely catastrophic. That's why, like, the last question, like, again, something that I alluded to before, do you think that the impact of the Russo-Ukrainian war and the way that it is going, is it rather going to inspire more inner Chinese consensus finding, like between Taipei and Beijing, or do you see it having the opposite effect? I mean, in the West, the idea is, oh my God, this is going to inspire China to take over Taiwan. I hope that's not the case. I mean, I hope that the incentive is going to be not the military solution for this conflict, like, or the inspiration for it.
I think the first reaction regarding the Taiwan issue came from the West, but that's a fundamental misjudgment. Between Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China, the two have very different approach to their respective national interest issue. For the Russian side, it was Ukraine. For the Chinese side, it was Taiwan. But for Putin, time was running out. That he just tried to justify his use of force on the ground, that the Ukraine is going to join NATO, even to adopt even nuclear weapons, restart nuclear program, and NATO would deploy troops. So his use force was the last resort. He was pushed to the corner and he had to do it. But the Taiwan issue was the opposite for China, because the Chinese believe first, peaceful unification remained the goal. And the Chinese believe time was on their side or our side. It was the US actually tried to push the envelope. This step away from those Shanghai communiques, and that's totally two different. The Chinese really want to postpone this eventuality or showdown with Taiwan, because China has been on steadily rise and increasing its economic power and national cohesion. But China has lots of time to play. But I think it was the Taiwan side started to fail, and that related to the U.S. approach. And plus, China has become such a political target. It's an evil thing, and anything China does is evil. So you start to see from Trump to Biden, the U.S. side push for more and more militarized issue, ideologicalized, the political identity issue. The Chinese want to say, well, no, let's two sides. The peaceful unification was the main issue. So Ukraine and Taiwan were very different for the two countries' political elite. For the Russian side, it's a last minute thing. If you don't do this, once Ukraine joined NATO, it's the end of anything. For the Chinese, the mainland Chinese wanted the status quo to go on, continue. And peaceful unification it's not an ideological thing. It's a historical issue. It doesn't matter who is in Beijing, whether it's a Communist Party, which is essentially a symbolic thing. And I think the Chinese CCP represent Chinese civilization. Even if an emperor sitting in Beijing, and he too would like to have unification with Taiwan. So it's not a political, you may say it's a nationalism, yes, but it's also a Chinese thing. It's not a normal state-to-state relationship. It's both sides of Taiwan Strait actually for a long time recognized one China. But Chinese mainland has the patience. But now it's that kind of a status quo is slipping away. So that's the danger. I think Ukraine and Taiwan are not necessarily the same, but the similarity may be seen from the other side. That from US side, both Russia and China are enemies, and Ukraine and Taiwan, and it could be and should be used by the West as a place to neutralize those two powers, like through proxy war in Taiwan too, with a weakened China, the United States would jump in maybe later. So that's always been the grand strategy of Washington. So we'll see how far these issues can be carried forward. But I hope that all sides will have more political realism and to work out things. In the age of nuclear weapons, there's no winners, by the way. Now, people, as you said, in talking about to win the war in Ukraine, I don't know how you win the war with nuclear power to Russia, by the way. And people forget Russia too has its legitimate security concern, even back to the Napoleon time. And the Russians talking about the third patriotic war today. The first one was Napoleon, the second one was Hitler. And now the third one. I think Russia's concern for its security needs to be recognized and if not respected, by the way. So that's, I think, the Europeans need to work out. Let me give you one thing that I'll stop for good. With regard to history lessons, in my article to Russia in global affairs. I mentioned the guns of the August 1914. I think that was a moment, it's a classic case of alliance-based international security or European security system that quickly locked into a 4-year carnage. Millions died, and more people died in the flu after the war. Europe was devastated, destroyed, largely because of these two hard military alliances. That, once Russian started partial mobilization, the Germans interpreted as a declaration of war and quickly declared war on each other within a matter of 1 week. And people forgot alliance not necessarily means peace. And the Ukraine conflict this time proved to be right. Alliance can be war. If both sides become hardcore allies, the world will be very dangerous. So China's neutrality today should be recognized and even praised, because what if China locked itself into a hard security-oriented alliance? There will be World War III in no time. And I think that's is the logical end, something like 1914. Now, after 1914, the Western countries learned too much, maybe. They switched to another extreme, that is appeasement. Now people, interpret everything, appeasement is bad, and so let's build a. So the West has been the switch between two extremes, either the 1914 alliance, or appeasement, and then push the dirty water to the east. I mean, the British French want to Hitler go to the east, and Stalin signed the treaties with Nazi Germany to turn them away to the west. And if you look at how long World War II broke out, I mean, between major countries, it took 14 years. The first war started in Manchuria. The Japanese seized the 3 northernmost provinces of my homeland in 1931. The last declaration of war was issued after the United States dropped nuclear weapons. That is, the Soviet Red Army declared war on Japan's Guangdong Army in Manchuria, again, my homeland. But it took 14 years for the major, parties of war to declare war on. So the world security system has gone between two extremes. One is, the alliance, and the other is no alliance. Forget about it. This is, a Chamberlain is now peace means appeasement. But after World War II, the West switched again to military alliance. Finally, Gorbachev Russia recognized danger and stopped and dissolved Warsaw Pact, but the West continued that alliance thing. So people only learn from the immediate past. Yeah. And nowhere they try to see the world from the middling point, which is neutrality.
You explain
between the two extremes, by the way. Now we're on the other extremes, the alliance. People forget 100-some years ago, alliance got Europe to war in a week. So alliance actually does not necessarily mean peace. Alliance means war, at least for 1914. So that's something people forget. That's the point I want to say. Your effort, the Neutrality Institute, is a noble, is a realistic, pragmatic thing that we need to see the world as it is rather than from the two extremes. Now, the world needs people to be in the middle, but unfortunately, the middling ground is disappearing. Not only the global stage, but also in all those countries. We see the United States, we see many European countries, those ideological extreme forces are taking hold. And that's the danger of the world. Now, I do not want to say that the Chinese Confucianism as the middling moderation was only for the Chinese. Let me give you one British story. There's a Goldilocks. I don't know, have you heard about the Goldilocks? The little girl found herself in a bear's family, and she found the chair was one too hard, one too big, one too small, and she found a middling, just one for her. And she found all the middling, the Goldilocks phenomenon. That's also the political wisdom for handling domestic and international conflict. And I think this goes all the way to your effort. I mean, from the neutrality perspective, I think it's a noble thing. It's something we need to have. It's not just a pure peace movement. It's a philosophy for seeking a middling, compromising ground for the warring parties. Okay, so that's something I think I want to express my appreciation for the Neutrality Institute and your effort. I think this is something we really need to go to the third way. It's not just only two extreme way, by the way. It's very easy to go to extremes, but it's hard to be in the middle. And democracy required the middling party.
Thank you very much for that.
We're missing.
You just explained something very important to me. You haven't used the word yet, but it's in your essay. And I had a Chinese student of mine trying to explain it to me, and I didn't understand it completely. And that's the idea of Chongyong, which is not the same. Yes. Which is not the same as neutrality, which is
it's more philosophical.
It's a philosophical. The doctrine of the mean, the doctrine of being between the extremes. So in a sense, what you explained is that China's current foreign policy approach is not so much of a neutrality between the alliances, but it is more of a middle way between alliance building and appeasement.
Let me add it to one component of Confucianism. Confucius himself actually regarded friendship, too close friendship, as something that make both sides discomfort. Only small people would get so close and telling each other, everything. That's small. What considered small people, which means they are not, morally or intellectually developed. If you're a gentleman, you should keep a distance from anyone. Be yourself. Be independent. That's Confucian. Ask your Chinese students. That's I can write it down in Chinese, and you let them see. That's what Confucius said. Small people get so close and share everything, and a noble people, a gentleman, would always have a distance with others. It doesn't mean you don't like others. You need to learn how to work with people who have different ideas, rather than only seek those people of same color or same democracy. The most important thing is to work with the countries with different culture, different political system. So democracy promotion effort like Biden people, it's for many Chinese who learn history and Confucius, this is funny. It's an identity approach. And countries are judged not because of what you do, but because who you are. That's naturally divided people from each other.
True. That is true.
That's racism all about. I mean, the most difficult thing is to work with those who disagree with you.
Yes. I don't know why it's so difficult to understand that. And people keep saying...
I'll write down the Chinese and send to you. You'll see it. I'll try to find a good translation. But the problem in world politics, Confucius is not only talk about interpersonal relationship, but interpersonal relationship is the basis for relations with the other members of the community, with other communities, with other countries. And you have to be able to work with those who disagree with you. That's the most difficult thing. How to do it? Impartiality. And that's something that the Chinese have been, try to search for the ultimate recipe for interpersonal relation, interstate relationship. I think that's something that we missed. So moderation is not necessarily a good thing. It's a lost art in the West. It's a lost thing in international politics. And alliance politics actually try to divide the world from what they see as themselves and others outside. This is religion all about. You know, religion by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Religion naturally divides the world between insiders, us, and them. In history, you have crusade. In modern time, you have war on terror. The notion of Islamic fascism is essentially is a religious, you know. The West too, this is we see that be with us or against us is very religious, by the way. And so West countries continue to have this very strong religious connotation in their foreign policy. The Chinese basically want to be with friends with everyone. China has not, I'm not defending China. China has a lot of problems, both domestic and in foreign policy too. But one thing alone China has not done is to fight a war. The last war was fought in 1979, 44 years ago, with Vietnam. It lasted less than a month, China withdrew. China also always withdraw. It fought the Americans and other UN forces in Korea and withdraw. It fought India and got back even to the north of Mekong line. It fought the Vietnamese and pulled back. So it's been 43 years since China fought the last war. And each war was border war, China's return. I'm not saying Chinese are better people or more peaceful. Chinese perhaps are different. Most of Chinese never believe and couldn't understand why you need to go to other countries. Let me bash a little bit of colonialism or imperialism of the West. This notion that the rest of the world should join the sanctions against Russia with NATO, with the United States. It's a very colonial, very imperialistic. Remind people that in those times, the colonial forces were drafted to fight the imperialist wars. Many Indians, Pakistanis, and they were all, join the British military, and these are imperialist wars. But if you look at the Chinese approach to it, the Chinese have no interest in other countries. Chinese don't understand why you got to other countries. You find a new world like Christopher Columbus. Now the problem comes in America. Christopher Columbus statue was pulled down. So try to do a good job in your homeland, and other countries would naturally emulate you. And that's the Confucius approach. Not to impose your view onto others, not to develop this too close relationship with others. If you do that, it's not necessarily China cannot make friends. Chinese believe friendship does not mean too closeness, but impartiality is more important. So that's something that it reminded me of a great American Chinese politics scholar, Harry Harding. He published many great books. One of them, he described the Chinese relation with the neighboring countries like Korea and others as aloofness, aloof, A-L-O-O-F, which means hands off others. And others decide which system they want to adopt. If they want to adopt the Confucius, let them do. If they don't want it, that's fine. It's none of Chinese business, right? So China has not fought a war since 1979. And this is a question. Donald Trump, as president, he asked former US President Jimmy Carter in early 2019, and he called Jimmy Carter, Mr. President, why the Chinese have done so much high-speed rails? How much we have? Carter, we don't have anything. Trump didn't understand. He said, why? Why we cannot build it? And Jimmy Carter's response to Donald Trump's question is, look, how many wars we fought? We haven't fought wars in the entire US history, only 16 years. So we've been constantly in war. And that's one of the issues, where your priority is. And so how do you handle foreign policy and relation with domestic politics? You have to do a good job at home first. The Chinese have learned the lessons of the past and continue to learn the past, by the way, for the future. And lots of problems in China. China itself is so big, so complex. And maybe because of that, China is always inward looking. But for Taiwan, it's a different thing, by the way. Because China regarded as an internal thing. That's a different from the Ukraine crisis. Majority of the world recognize Ukraine as a legitimate, sovereign, independent state. But 180 countries recognize Taiwan as part of China. At least they pay lip service to it. So that's totally two different issues, by the way.
Yeah, it is. No disagreement with that. That's why it is so much. I think the Taiwan issue is even much more difficult to solve than the Ukraine one. To Ukraine, there's a very simple solution, and it's neutrality and withdrawal from those parts.
Yeah. But the Chinese really want a neutral Ukraine, by the way. Mm-hmm. They have so many good things about Ukraine. This is I think people may argue, well, it's a communism, it's a domination of the party. That's not necessarily the case. The domestic debate about Ukraine conflict is so diverse, so divided. The Chinese actually in the internet became kind of people divided between pro-Russian, pro-Ukraine, and such a diverse opinion. You never see this as we use the case in the United States. You don't see any meaningful realist opinions in the chat rooms, in the media. Only one thing, liberal interventionism there. But in China, it's a diverse opinions. And for simple reason, both Russia and China, Ukraine are good friends of China. And Chinese have been, developing really good relations, something even more than the relation with Russia. For example, in terms of military technology, Chinese have imported so much stuff from Ukraine, from aircraft, those old aircraft, they renovated and then they copied it, they built their own. And the aircraft carrier-based jet fighters now become, a standard in Chinese arsenal. They're from Ukraine, by the way. So Ukraine has been far more generous. And now more recently, when Ukraine exhausted, finished all those Soviet left military technology, they started to become a major trade partner, one of the largest in Eastern Europe. And also the Ukraine has become a major hub for China's Belt and Road Initiative, and something that the Chinese have been busy building across Eurasian heartland, and so much energy and excessive capacity, and the Chinese really building things. So Ukraine has been very important. Ukraine also provides China with a huge amount of increasingly agricultural product. The Chinese agriculture company even rented the land in Ukraine and produce grain over there. So the two sides really work out lots of good things. And I think the Chinese domestic debate reflect the kind of diverse opinion, and the government has to respect that, because the majority of the Chinese really believe they want a stable, predictable world. If the Chinese are very pragmatic, business oriented. If you want to do business, you want to travel, you want to do sightseeing, you want to study, you don't go to the war zone, by the way, unless you're stupid. So they go to those places where stable, peaceful. So Chinese, ordinary China, naturally for political stability and predictability. China, before COVID, has 120 million people travel abroad. Almost everybody returned to China, by the way. And that's something extraordinary. Chinese start to learn far more about the rest of the world. And they enjoy to see the diverse world. They were out now to change them. They were out to find how good things other countries have. Unlike many Western countries, they go to, third world countries to find, you have to do this, you have to do that, give them a to-do list. Why they don't spend time to learn how they can learn from those locals? The Chinese are curious, by the way, how other countries can do the same thing differently, and how we can improve those. The Chinese send so many students abroad. Try to learn from everybody, not just big Western countries, but many countries. The Chinese are very curious, but they look for stability. That's something fundamentally behind China's neutrality or principle of neutrality. For stability and for peace. That's something I hope people would understand the Chinese, not opportunistic. If you look at domestic debate, so many of my friends become enemies now. And they in the internet chat rooms, they argue against each other, but of course they all for peace and stability. So that's a very different, diverse public space in China. I hope that you don't see this in Western media if you don't read Chinese, and the internet has become monopolized by BBC, by
and divided. It's not one. It's like very much little tribes everywhere.
Yeah, but the dominant. You see the liberal media in the United States, and ironically, only few conservatives now talk about the peace, like
Tucker Carlson,
and really, but you can be allowed to pro-Russia, but you cannot be allowed to pro-China. Realists in America,
it's true.
Very interesting. They want to stop war with Russia because they believe there's another bigger war with China, like Mearsheimer. Mearsheimer really for that. That's been consistent, and he was well known in China. He's well known. Realist, not so realist. His theory of offensive realism is really so different from a classic political realism of the European style. He's very close to militarism. He sees conflict between major powers would have no solution except killing each other. That's not the political realism. That's militarism. That's crazy. But he still strongly argues, let's stop Ukraine war and let's stop war with Russia because we want to fight China for no reason other than they are Chinese. I don't know. That's identity politics.
Yeah, it's ideology. It's ideology. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a very very
and projection. The projection of what would the United States do if it was China? It would try to expand over the Pacific, which is what they did from their side, right? And the projection that that's what they must be doing. But I do share your analysis that if we look at least the Cold War period and before that. There's no reason to believe that China will try to rule Japan and then move to Hawaii and then move to San Francisco. I just don't see that under any reasonable scenario happening.
But the people in the West in general, I think, because we start to see the trend in NATO now. This is just before, shortly after, the outbreak of the Ukraine conflict. The British Foreign Minister, Liz, I think her name is Liz Truss, and he made this most forceful declaration that the UK rejected for the false choice between Euro-Atlantic security and the Indo-Pacific security, unquote, in favor of a global NATO. For the Chinese, NATO has enough problem in Europe. Why come to? And this is like going back to the 1860s, the Opium War, and then the 8 powers joint invasion of Beijing and burning the Summer Palace and looted the entire city. And we see the replay of history that the problem is the West itself has so many problems. Why you don't make the West itself a beautiful place first? Here is the totally different thing in China. You don't have an enemy for most of Chinese. Most of Chinese want to, come to the West to study, to learn. I mean, and they still see the West offer so much, from the British soccer and basketball in the United States and the best colleges, universities in the world. And the majority of Chinese, they use, if you judge the political sentiment of the Chinese, look at where they send their only child to the West. You don't have an enemy. They don't want to fight the West. They want to interact with the West because the West offers so much. Even if the West has so many problems, everyone has problems. The Chinese are very pragmatic people. They want the United States to be stable, strong and self-confident, not just angry with everybody. The Chinese travel to the United States not to look for, you have this problem, race problem. No, the Chinese come to America to look for things they don't understand, they don't have it. People, again, curious about how America has been an attractive place for so many peoples in the world. So people curious about how they could learn, unlike, the media in the West that coming to China, you do this, you do that. How bad you are, this is, I don't know. It's incompatible. It's asymmetrical motivation, and that clash of the two asymmetrical culture, that is perhaps the most tragic thing. That even if the West and the United States want to fight the Chinese and China, the Chinese lack that motivation, unless the Taiwan issue becomes explosive, by the way.
Yeah.
But in normal times, the Chinese really curious about the West in general, the US in particular. So you have very asymmetrical, the Chinese not interested. They send the only son and daughter, so much money to US university, to British, to European universities. And this is, the Chinese are very international, by the way. They try to learn from everybody. And that's a line behind this, the tragic past, the unstable, the civil wars, the foreign invasions, or the Chinese call it 100 years of humiliation at the hands of the West.
That is something that's deep in China, but that the West completely forgets how much Asia, China has been under Western, has suffered under the West very much. I mean, the whole idea of colonialism is just like an afterthought in the West. Oh yeah, that happened, but it's long time ago.
They forgot everything. They forgot not only Asians in the eyes of white Europeans, Americans. It's like a exotic place. Let me give you one case since you're in Japan. This is even you are strong, powerful Asian nation in 1919. You joined the war, you won the war on the winner side. You're still treated as a lesser species because in Versailles, Japan wanted to be treated as equal with the West, but the European democracy, the British and French, particularly the two of them, and refused to grant Japan the equal status that they have the rights to invade other countries. The Japanese really wanted the equality clause. You're in Japan, but the liberal democracies rejected. It's on the racist ground, because no matter how powerful you are, you're not the same as us. So that really infuriated the Japanese nationalists, and they start to hate, the Western liberalism, and they see it as a fake, and they were humiliated, and that fueled the Japanese and it drove them into militarism and start to take over one part of Asia after another in the name of fighting against Western. But you know what? It is the Asians who suffered most.
Yes.
35 million Chinese casualty in 14 years of war, by the way. And China was devastated by the Japanese. And something that militarism was at least partially driven by Western racism. That's, I think, for better or worse, is part of Japanese history, and believe they were humiliated by the West. And I think that's Western history needs to be understood by Westerners themselves, and something that people have really short memory of history. I believe World War I should remind people about the other side of the lines. The people now. Rushing to alliance become a fashionable thing, but security always mutual. It's security. The notion of security dilemma is one side has security, more security means the less. But in the Cold War turned to be a long peace, by the way, according to John Gaddis of United States, and he argues strongly the Cold War actually was a particular period of time when both sides recognized bilateral security. Soviet security requires America too felt secure, and vice versa. So arms control treaties, those inspection, verification mechanism all in place, particularly after Cuban Missile Crisis. Both sides realize the unilateral security is not to work out things. You got to accept bilateral security. Now, with the end of the Soviet Union, with the new unipolar power, the notion of bilateral security was gone for good, and the NATO expansion was to go, became the only solution, and that's the tragic thing. I think the Cold War, for better or worse, I believe it was part of the good old days, and now we're into the uncharted territories or waters, and something we don't understand. We walk into this dark alley, and hoping that we will defeat the other side. How could you defeat the nuclearized Russia, by the way? And that's really a bizarre thinking, that you should win the war.
That's why I'm so scared. I'm very scared. I think we've never been closer to absolute catastrophe than now. I think this is more dangerous than 1962. Yeah, I'm seriously scared.
Kissinger warned in the past 2 years multiple times, unless major powers like the United States and China work out things, the world will be a much, much darker place. And in this, not only the weapons of mass destruction, but also artificial intelligence. And that is automatically something like the 1914 alliance that automatically locked countries into those senseless wars that nobody would have any chance to win, by the way. They have only one chance, common chance: you perish together. And that's something that I think many in the West need to think about. For all the Russians' invasions of Ukraine, I think the solution lies somewhere in the middle. I think that's China's approach to neutrality. I don't know how far this would go, but before the Taiwan issue become alive. But I hope the Ukraine issue can be soft landed, because weapons is not. You do not fight a war without a political vision. The ultimate settlement must be political. And in the age of weapons of mass destruction, right? So I think neutrality is and should be regarded as a legitimate concept for foreign policy, and not just neutrality, but positive neutrality. I think some of the things you talked about, and we need to wake up the West and see how much this can be understood and pursued. Let me stop.
Thank you very much. I intended to make this 45 minutes. I think now we're way over 90, but I couldn't stop asking you. I couldn't stop, because thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, and maybe we'll make 2 videos of this, but no, this was a very good conversation, and I was very glad to get your perspective and to hear your analysis. And I share most of the points that you mentioned. So thank you for that.